Hello, respected viewers. It's George from Ireland. Welcome back to my channel. And this is about The Case for Colonialism by Bruce Gilley. Because books which are condemnatory of colonialism are 10 a penny. And it's just held as axiomatic that colonialism stroke imperialism is a boo word, must be evil, must be based on racialism, and so on. And that its positive consequences were minimal. There are many who claim it was an unmitigated evil, and so on. There'll be long and loud denunciations by this. So it's useful to have a corrective, to have just one book which puts the other side of the case. But for some bigots, their opinions are unopposable, are not open to question. So these people are the enemies of free inquiry. And sadly, they're increasingly dominating academia, as well as politics, the media, the judiciary, almost all spheres of public life. There is In Praise of Empires by Deepak Lal. There are not many books which take this view these days, and you can see why, because you'd be hounded out of the academy. As Bruce Gilley says, I mean, he's aware that some colleagues share some of his views, but they choose to keep their heads down because I think it'd be more than your career is worth. Now, I don't contest anybody's right to compose a denunciation of colonialism, and I've read articulations of anti-imperialism all the time. So I've always exposed myself to the countervailing view. I'm an imperialist, incidentally. Obviously, I'd like to bring back the British Empire. I know it's completely impractical. It's never, ever going to happen. And to do it in the 21st century, if it were possible, which it isn't, it would have to be rather different from it was in the 20th century. But so Bruce Gilley is a distinguished academic, and he's got degrees from some of the top universities in the world. I think McGill, which is Canada's most renowned university, first of all, got that right. A master's degree at Oxford University, and I can't remember where he took a doctorate. And he's lectured at top universities in the United States. Did he lecture at Harvard for a while? And there was an article he published in the Third World Quarterly, which got him death threats, which got 16,000 people signing a petition asking for its retraction, people saying his career should be over, people saying there ought to be the rescission of his doctorate, and so forth, the revocation of any titles he'd be conferred on. So they tried to drive him out of academic life. Absolutely furious screeds. And I think that the rationality of his opponents was inversely proportional to their emotion, because shrieking is no substitute for thinking. And there are people who've are sort of on the other side of the debate, black and British, David Obugola, if I got his name correct, and he said that he's got death threats. He's had a bodyguard. Now, nobody should be subjected to death threats for expressing his opinions, no matter how distasteful they are. So I found it a deeply engrossing book, in places convincing, in places unconvincing, and so it looks at mostly Western imperialism. Thing is, recorded history goes back about 5,000 years. We can only have history, we have writing. Before that's prehistory. And imperialism is as old as history. Other countries have established control of other countries forcefully and sometimes consensually, and some formally, sometimes informally, and also begs the question, what's a country? It's almost indefinable. And because colonialism is seen as to be a bad thing, people will often claim to be a colony if they want to get out of any political entity. So that's it. So imperialism has always been around. And imperialism has its credit, as its debit column. Imperialism is like saying something like economics. Well, it's quite economic at its basis, or science. I mean, it depends what you use it for. You could be doing good things, you could be doing evil things. They might be indifferent. So we can't condemn just a whole practice. So yeah, there are pros and cons to all of them. So he outlines his case for colonialism. It's slightly autobiographical. He said how the lynch mob tried to annihilate him, his lecture, and then he riposts to what his opponents had to say, and they claim it's a disgrace to do so. So it's written in lucid and often compelling prose, and what I like is readability, because often it's just impenetrable the way these scholars write. Now, I mean, I'm not thick and I can read, but sometimes their sentences of almost 100 words, like not exaggerating, and so many subordinate clauses. And I just, they're sort of blinding with lexis. And I just get lost in these polysyllabic words. So they think that the more incomprehensible their work is, the more valuable it is, which is preposterous. And he's not like that, because he recognizes the purpose of writing is communication, not obfuscation. And maybe it speaks volumes about anti-imperialists that they're more likely to write in prose, which is notorious for its opacity. So he says African civilization. Now, European imperialism from the 17th century on was talking about the civilizing mission. And as he correctly observes, there are levels of civilization. It's not binary. You're civilized or uncivilized. And barbarity and civilization can coexist in the same society, even in the same individual. You look at ancient Rome, in some ways the pinnacle of civilization at the time, and yet public entertainment involved seeing people torn apart by wild beasts. You look at highly civilized societies today, like Germany, since 1945, tried to make itself the most humane country in the world, or maybe the United Kingdom, or Sweden, or the USA, or Canada, or Japan, however you want to think it, and yet they're barbaric at the same time, and so on. You look at, say, 18th century Britain, the United Kingdom, the leading science and technology country in the world, in some ways very refined, and yet it was extraordinarily cruel with the transatlantic slave trade. So sophistication and cruelty are not necessarily contradictory. And so it goes on. He looks at different episodes of colonialism and says it's always got to be something which is relative. Say this was bad, but as compared to what? What was the alternative? What was going on before? So you see how places like Zambia went from the Iron Age to the Jet Age in just 2 generations of British imperialism. And really nowhere else in the world, apart from the interior of Africa, has ever advanced so fast. Societies without the wheel, without any form of writing. You see there's a population explosion in many of these African colonies of France and the United Kingdom and so forth. Why? Because healthcare got there, because hygiene improved dramatically. So the infant mortality fell, lifespan increased enormously, and food supply increased, and there were just even fewer accidents or fewer wild beasts depredating people. So that we often hear that imperialism was genocidal, which is a foul slur and really diminishes the suffering of those who actually experience genocide. But genocide doesn't increase the population, does it? It decreases it. And you can't possibly say that when people pullulate, or as Churchill observed about British India, the Indian population exploded under Britannic superintendence, whereas the American Indians, they were reduced drastically in number. So these numbers, they tell a story, and so on. So ironically, it's in the early 20th century that India's population growth really took off as it was coming up towards the end of the British Raj. And he's often accused of Holocaust denialism. I mean, he has not a word to say about the Holocaust. But he points out that people could just make up a number about the number of deaths caused by Belgian colonialism in the Congo. Previously, Leopold II, King of the Belgians. Remember, he was ruling in his personal capacity, his fiefdom there, the Congo Free State. The Belgian elected government had no role till about 1908. And because we don't know the population, people are just making up the figures. And there's a whole King Leopold's ghost controversy. I mean, I don't know that much about it, but it seems very likely that some Congolese had their hands chopped off for not meeting the rubber quota, which is, of course, monstrous, should never, ever be done to anyone. The numbers are up for question. And so on. I think one of the weaker bits of Gilley's case is when he claims the Congo Free State wasn't imperialism because it wasn't controlled by the government of Belgium, merely by Leo the Second personally. But that's preposterous because the Dutch East India Company in Indonesia and so forth, we know that that was imperialism, even though it wasn't the Dutch government directly, or the British East India Company ruling much of India right up until 1858. Yes, that was imperialism, even though it was not the government of the United Kingdom directly. The UK government took a greater and greater role. And there are other examples. I mean, you could say the British South African Company, which established control of what's now Zambia and Zimbabwe. Loads of these things were companies rather than the government directly. But nevertheless, it was imperialism, especially the shareholders often advanced in politics. So Yeah, and he thought that colonialism was brought to an end too early. He's notably written a biographer of the what is it, the last British governors of the Gold Coast. It's now called Ghana, who made the moral case for the continuation of imperialism and said, no, this moving towards decolonization is too fast and it will end in tears as disastrous. And when the Gold Coast got to vote on this, about 10% of the parliamentarians in the Gold Coast, that's Ghana's legislature, voted against. And I take my hat off to these men and women who had the foresight, who had the moral courage and the wisdom to hold out against the demagogues. And you see what harm ochlocracy does. And then it ended up in tyranny under Kwame Nkrumah and many cataclysms. I know Ghana's come out the other side and is one of the best, most developed countries in West Africa now. And anyway, he goes on to say how it was right. Even Portuguese imperialism until 1975, and this was when Portugal was a reactionary authoritarian state. Some would say fascist. How even that conferred beneficence upon the peoples of Guinea-Bissau, Angola, Mozambique, Cabo Verde, and so on, and how cataclysmic imperialism was, particularly for Guinea-Bissau. So, you have to look at what the alternatives, the before and after, and the choice in life, in politics, in governance, is not often between bad and good. It's been being bad and even worse. It's the lesser of two evils. Anyway, and he publishes a highly contentious defense of King Leopold's Congo, which I don't find very persuasive. About Malaya, much of it's part of Malaysia, about Yemen, about how disastrous the termination of the British superintendence of Yemen was, South Arabia, as they used to call it, South Yemen, and so on. How those colonies in the United States and Canada, and Americans are often kidding themselves they weren't an imperial power. They were. Establishing ports on the coast of China, taking all sorts of Pacific islands, Puerto Rico, and so on. Puerto Rico to this day, and U.S. Virgin Islands to this day, are territories of the United States, not states. And the Puerto Ricans want to join the United States. They're not being allowed in. If they wanted independence, would that be granted? It's debatable. The United States ruled the Philippines as a colony, and there are pros and cons. So imperialism, it had its downsides. It was sometimes evil, there were sometimes atrocities. You can look at really negative imperialism. The Ottoman Empire had very little to recommend it. If you're bringing scientific advances, if you're improving technology, if you're improving human rights, then there's a strong case for imperialism. And as Gilley says, that some people actively supported imperialism, some of the peoples of the colonies, some people were indifferent, some were against. That they shouldn't all be panned as traitors or whatever, Uncle Toms, who recognized the benefits of imperialism and wanted it to include, and so on. The good fortune of being enslaved in America. Well, though the people enslaved suffered horrendously, there's no doubt, being abducted, being branded, being whipped, tortured, forced to work under the lash in the broiling sun, many women raped, many people murdered. There's no question that was absolutely satanic. But their descendants, several generations later, are far better off than people in almost any other country in Africa. Now, the Europeans who enslaved people, or rather purchased people already enslaved in West Africa, were not doing so out of kindness. They were doing so out of cruelty and the wish to exploit. As it happened, the unintended corollary is it was beneficial to the descendants of the victims several generations later, and so on. Now, I know they see, oh, well, their pathologies that date back to that time, but nevertheless, African Americans have chosen to stay in the United States, as they're absolutely entitled to. Very few move to Liberia, but they're far better off than their very distant cousins in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Nigeria, in Senegal, and so on, and so on. So he says about how the British Empire was so good for Canada. And how does a former colony end up? You got Singapore on one end of the scale, and then maybe got Zimbabwe on the other. So pros and cons. And anything positive that's achieved post-colonial, we're told by the anti-imperialists, is not a legacy of imperialism. Anything terrible is because of imperialism. I mean, they can't make up their mind. And also self-contradictory, claiming that imperialism was too disruptive and yet not disruptive enough. It changed things and yet it didn't change things as much as it should have done. Or quoting Chinua Achebe, that celebrated Nigerian novelist who published Things Fall Apart just before the end of Britannic rule in Nigeria, and him lauding imperialism. Even Patrice Lumumba, supposedly the poster boy of anti-imperialism, for his renowned 1960 oration at the Congolese independence ceremonies, where he stuck it to the Belgians in the presence of King Baudouin, a speech which cost him his life. But anyway, even he had warm words for imperialism a few years earlier. So it's really scintillating. I warmly recommend this book to you. I don't agree with everything that he has to say, but he really expostulates the case for imperialism. And I know it can never ever come back. There's been a loss of imperial will. Western countries have run down their militaries. The minds of people all over the world have been poisoned. This knee-jerk reaction to think that imperialism is necessarily a legal thing makes its re-establishment an impossibility, which is an awful pity. And there are people who urgently need recolonization are not going to have it. Okay, and some former colonies definitely don't need it, and some really do need it. But it's not going to happen. Like Lord Butler said, politics is the art of the possible. Deal with the situations we are in now. So the premature dissolution of the British Empire was the geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, and so much misery rates back to that time. And they say, oh well, this conflict was caused by British imperialism. I mean, to some extent that's true. It's often by the end of British imperialism, its continuation would not have caused it, and people come to regret it. So goodness, now no one should be mistreated on the grounds of his or her race, ethnicity, religion. That ought to go without saying. So there are scarlet sins of imperialism to talk about. He talks about German Southwest Africa and the casualty figures for the Herero people, civilians murdered by the Second Reich in German Southwest Africa is hugely exaggerated. I don't know the truth of that. I know it's a very controversial statement, but even he is impliedly accepting the German army deliberately killed civilians there. It's questionable how many there were. Obviously, that should never be done. Now, I mean, every army has committed war crimes, which doesn't make them permissible. Some armies have a worse record than others. The German army, I'm sorry to say, not being remotely anti-German, until 1945 was about the worst in the world. So I wouldn't find it hard to believe that there'd be large-scale massacres of people there. So goodness. Anyway, I wouldn't try and force any country to become a colony. If they wish to, they could be accepted. But I'm not aware that any country has a majority of people who wish to. And I realise that various former colonial metropoles, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, Denmark, even Austria to some extent, don't want to take them back. But how did Hinduism spread out of India? That was imperialism, wasn't it? How did Islam spread out of Syria, Saudi Arabia? That was imperialism, wasn't it? African countries colonized each other. The major empires in West Africa, their economies were funded by enslavement. The Incas, the Aztecs, they all had empires, they all had colonies, and they usually didn't particularly improve the lives of the subject peoples. China was an empire which conquered the Manchus or the Tibetans, made Korea a vassal state, likewise Vietnam. So imperialism is not just a Western thing, not just a white thing. We ought to get used to that idea. All right. Thank you very much for watching my channel. Make sure you subscribe on Patreon. Donate to PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Toodaloo.